Imagine the entire history of human civilization squashed into a single day. By the time we hit 11:59 p.m., all we've done from building pyramids to launching satellites has only just begun. The real question is, what the hell were we doing the rest of the day? For 23 hours and 58 minutes, humans were basically cavemen. And then, in the final 60 seconds, everything changed. But here's the weird part, there's a missing sliver of time, a forgotten window of history so bizarre that most people don't even know it existed. That gap is known as the Mesolithic Era. The name comes from two Greek words, mesos, meaning middle, and lithos, meaning stone, a literal reference to being stuck between the rough stone tools of the Paleolithic and the farming revolution of the Neolithic. But here's the catch. The Mesolithic isn't as cleanly defined as its siblings. In fact, in a lot of the world, it's treated like the awkward cousin nobody wants to invite to the party. In China, for example, archaeologists usually just skip it, jumping straight from Paleolithic to early Neolithic like it's a software update nobody asked for. The timing of the Mesolithic jumps all over the map depending on the region. In Europe, it lasted from around 15,000 to 5,000 years ago. In the Middle East, they call this phase the Epi-Paleolithic, because of course they do, and it ran from roughly 20,000 to 10,000 years ago, with the mysterious Natfari culture leading the way. In Northern Europe, where the Ice Age took its sweet time melting away, this period lasted until about 5,500 years ago. So what was actually going on during this murky stretch of time? Well, picture the end of the last Ice Age. It's around 20,000 years ago, and the glaciers are finally packing up. Sea levels rise, the air gets warmer, and the planet starts switching from giant icy plains to thick forests. That might sound like a win, but for humans, it was a logistical nightmare. Their massive prey mammoths, woolly rhinos, and other Ice Age megafauna either vanished or fled, forcing humans to scrap their big game hunting ways and improvise with whatever was left. Rabbits, berries, and fish. Basically, if you couldn't catch it, you had to fish it or forage it. But the Mesolithic wasn't just a transitional snooze fest. It was humanity's first real test lab, a chaotic experimental phase where survival strategies evolved, food sources diversified, and something strange began to stir in the human brain. People started sticking around in one place longer, building early campsites near rivers and lakes, and even experimenting with new diets. This is when humans began to invent, decorate, adapt, and unknowingly set the stage for the next major plot twist in human history: the invention of farming. Just as the forests were closing in, so were the limits of old tools. With fewer mammoths and more fiddly tasks, humans needed sharper, smarter tools, and so they came up with microliths, tiny but deadly stone fragments, often just a few centimeters long. These weren't your average caveman rocks. People carefully shaped flakes of flint or chert, then glued them into wooden or bone handles to make everything from arrows to fishing hooks. It was like the IKEA of the Stone Age modular tools for every situation. Break one? Just swap out the microlith. Efficient and sharp, literally. At a place called Pine Hollow in modern-day England, archaeologists unearthed an entire toolbox of these gadgets and even deer skull masks, suggesting some kind of ritual or fancy prehistoric cosplay. Not too far off in Denmark, a piece of blackened birch pitch was found with actual human bite marks on it. Turns out, someone, probably a woman around 5,700 years ago, chewed it like gum after a hearty meal of duck and chestnuts. Not bad for a Stone Age snack. And by this point, humans weren't wandering aimlessly anymore. They were building semi-permanent camps near coasts and rivers, setting up shop where food, water, and shelter were easier to find. Some of these sites show signs of long-term use, not quite cities, but a big step up from cave hopping. The Mesolithic toolkit expanded beyond stone too. Bone, wood, and antler were used to make sewing needles, baskets, even shoes. In Spain's Cueva de los Murciélagos, which literally means bat cave, Yes, really, archaeologists found woven items and early footwear that suggest ancient humans were already experimenting with textile skills. Batman would be proud. Over 9,500 years ago, our ancestors weren't just gnawing on bones in a cave, they were basically running prehistoric tasting menus. At ancient hearths, archaeologists have found an impressively diverse spread: carp bones, wild duck remnants, tiny deer, singed nutshells, even early clay pots that looked like something out of an ancient cooking show. These weren't just survivalists scraping by, they were thinkers, tinkerers, and proto-foodies. They weren't living just to live. They were experimenting, innovating, and prepping for a future that would flip the human experience upside down. When the Ice Age finally tapped out around 20,000 years ago, many expected humans to just keep moving as they always had. But something odd happened. They stayed. The climate warmed, sea levels rose, and what used to be vast dry plains turned into tangled swamps and thick forests. The humans who stuck around Europe didn't experience one neat cultural shift. Instead, dozens of distinct Mesolithic societies popped up, shaped by their own local challenges and weird environmental curveballs. Take the Nordlanders, okay? Archaeologists call them the Maglemosians, who lived in what's now Denmark between 11,000 and 8,000 years ago. These folks weren't building empires, but they did have a knack for survival. They camped near lakes, crafted microliths, hunted deer, and fished like pros. Their toolkit included bonefish hooks and wooden paddles, and they were among the first to use dugout canoes to glide across lakes like prehistoric gondoliers. Then there were the Kaldak people, technically the Kunda culture, who thrived around the Baltic Sea from 10,500 to 7,000 years ago. These folks mastered the art of turning red deer antler and bone into tools, hunting beavers, seals, and marsh birds in what can only be described as Europe's oldest water park. Meanwhile, in Britain, the Starkmere site known today as Star Carr has yielded some strange and fascinating finds. Red deer, skull masks, no explanation needed, just accept it, microliths, and a wooden lakefront platform, showing they likely lived there for months at a time. Think of it as a seasonal Airbnb, Stone Age edition. Further south, the alien people, a culture that emerged across France and Spain between 14,000 and 10,000 years ago, showed a more artistic streak. These early tribes created pebbles, covered in mysterious symbols, and likely used bows and arrows. Some archaeologists believe they were the first to move away from giant mammoth murals and toward more abstract, symbolic art, kind of like going from cave graffiti to modern art galleries. Over in Scotland, a bizarre find at Warren Hollow revealed 12 shallow pits forming a crescent. These pits lined up with the moon's 29.5-day cycle and date back 10,000 years, possibly the oldest lunar calendar ever discovered. Yep, Mesolithic people might have invented moon tracking way before it was trendy. In Denmark, another curious group known as the Eravik people, or Ertebøl culture, if you want to sound scholarly, lived from 7,300 to 5,900 years ago. They were like the bridge crew between Mesolithic and Neolithic societies. They fished, gathered mussels, hunted small game, and buried their dead with ceremony. They even had pottery, but no farming or livestock. These groups coexisted with early European farmers for over 2,000 years. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they competed. But for centuries, it wasn't farmers replacing hunter-gatherers. It was both groups awkwardly sharing a continent, shaping each other, until eventually their ways of life blended into something new. But culture isn't just about tools and food, it's about art. And Mesolithic art marks a dramatic turning point. In the Paleolithic, animals got all the attention: bison, lions, mammoths. But suddenly, humans became the stars. In Spain's rugged El Colt rock shelter, over 45 small human figures were etched into stone, showing people dancing, hunting, even engaging in rituals. One famous carving shows a group of women dancing around a lone male figure, a scene dubbed the cult dance, believed to hint at fertility rites or early expressions of gender identity. But the creativity didn't stop at murals. Mesolithic folks also turned to sculpture. In ancient Palestine, the Asari embrace, a small figurine carved from calcite shows two humans locked in a tender embrace. It's the oldest known depiction of human intimacy. Not crude, not obscene, just symbolic of love, connection, and belonging. Far away in the deep Ural forests of Russia, something even stranger was found. The Shogor idol, a 5-meter tall wooden statue with eerie faces and abstract patterns carved into it. Dated to around 11,500 years ago, it's the oldest known wooden sculpture in existence. Its exact purpose? Unknown. Worship, warning, ancestor reverence, your guess is as good as the experts. Deep in the woods at the old Starkmere site, something creepy and spectacular emerged. Over 30 red deer skull masks, each one carefully drilled, reshaped, and designed to be worn like a helmet. Picture a prehistoric masquerade, except instead of tuxedos and champagne, you've got animal skulls and ritualistic chanting. Were they shamans, hunters, or just very committed cosplayers? Either way, it shows that Mesolithic people had more on their minds than dinner. They were thinking about identity, ceremony, and maybe even the afterlife. These weren't isolated oddities either. At the same site, archaeologists unearthed necklaces engraved with geometric designs, amber pendants, and slate jewelry. Not exactly the kind of gear you'd expect from people supposedly just surviving. This suggests something deeper, a symbolic understanding of self, community, and belief. Mesolithic art wasn't just about making things look nice. It reflected how people saw the world and their place in it. This was the moment humans shifted from reacting to nature to imagining new realities. From chasing animals to building culture. From surviving to living. Now here's where it gets surprisingly modern. Pottery and textiles. Yep, the Mesolithic people weren't just running around with spears, they were boiling, steaming, and crafting like ancient chefs and designers. One of the most unexpected twists in archaeology is that pottery, once thought to be a byproduct of farming, actually predates agriculture in many areas. In parts of Eastern Europe, the Baltics, and Siberia, groups like the Urvik people, aka Ertugrul, were cooking up meals in clay pots thousands of years before they ever tilled a field. Across regions like Narva, Estonia, Swifterhaven, Netherlands, and riverside sites in Russia, archaeologists have found chunky, pointed base pots covered in soot, stuffed with fish bones, grease residue, and plant starch, evidence of boiling or stewing. Forget roasting over open flames, they were running ancient kitchens, experimenting with flavor and texture. Some of this cookware dates back nearly 9,000 years, like the finds along the Volga River and Lake Baleen. The kicker? These people still hadn't planted a single crop. No livestock, no plows, just fish, nuts, and fire-hardened clay. It proves that innovation didn't need wheat fields and sheep herding. Culture came first, and agriculture followed. At the same time, the early textile scene was coming alive. In Spain's Cueva de los Museos, yes, still Bat Cave, archaeologists uncovered woven baskets made from seagrass that date back over 9,000 years. Alongside them, sandals dyed with natural pigments and decorated with geometric patterns, zigzags, diamonds, you name it. These weren't just functional, they were stylish. They show that even without looms or spinning wheels, people were already manipulating plants into objects of use and beauty, the earliest echoes of fashion and design. This was more than survival. It was the birth of craftsmanship where fire met clay and hands turned wild plants into woven culture. But the Mesolithic story isn't just European. Around the world, people lived through this mysterious window in time, they just called it something else. In Europe, Mesolithic is a common label. But in other regions, local climate shifts and cultural quirks mean different names and timelines. Take China. There, the term Mesolithic barely gets used. Most archaeologists go straight from Paleolithic to Neolithic, skipping the awkward middle like a bad sequel. But at Shillong Cave in Jiangxi province, The oldest known pottery in the world was discovered dating back 20,000 to 19,000 years ago. That's before agriculture, before cities, even before the Mesolithic technically began. These early Chinese communities were still hunter-gatherers, but they already had the skills to craft pots. So in China, pottery doesn't mean farming, and calling it Mesolithic doesn't really add anything useful. India, on the other hand, embraces the term. There, the Mesolithic stretched from about 12,000 to 8,000 years ago. At sites like Bagur, Chapanimando, and Bimka, people lived along rivers, made microlithic tools, and slowly began experimenting with planting millets and wild rice. It wasn't full-on farming, but it was a sign of what was coming, the first shaky steps toward a semi-nomadic, food-producing lifestyle. Meanwhile, in the Americas, the labels change again. In North America, this era is called the Archaic period, running from about 8,000 to 2,000 BCE, roughly the same as Europe's Mesolithic. In Mesoamerica, it's known as the Meso-Indian period. But here's the twist. Despite all the different names and timelines, these groups share key traits. They all show evidence of small-scale hunting, localized tool innovations, and early steps towards settlement, the same strange middle zone between wild and civilized. Across North Africa, in places like ancient Tarsilia and Agar, now dry stretches of Algeria, something surprising was left behind. Thousands of years ago, this wasn't desert. It was lush savanna, bursting with wildlife and home to a strange fusion of Mesolithic and Neolithic people. And they made sure we wouldn't forget them. Carved into rock faces are vivid images of humans riding horses, hunting, dancing, and conducting strange rituals. These were not random doodles, they were statements. Evidence of communities on the edge of two eras, experimenting with how to live in a world that was changing fast. From fishing gear and microlithic tools to the first signs of settling down, these groups were part of a global pattern. Everywhere, Europe, Africa, Asia, the Americas, the end of the Ice Age threw humanity into environmental chaos. Forests swallowed plains, glaciers collapsed, animals migrated or vanished. But instead of one grand, unified response, humans did what they do best. They improvised, they adapted, and they did it in 1,000 different ways. Which brings us to one of the most underappreciated chapters in human history, the slow, chaotic, and often awkward fall of the Mesolithic. Around 10,000 years ago, a new cultural package began spreading out of the Fertile Crescent like a Stone Age startup kit. It included wheat, sheep, pottery, stone axes polished to a shine, and houses big enough to settle down for good. It was the Neolithic Revolution, and it swept through Europe and West Asia like wildfire. But here's the twist. Not everyone signed up. Some Mesolithic groups looked at the farmers and their muddy fields and said, "Nah, we're good." In regions like Central Europe and the Balkans, many local foragers blended with the incoming farmers, adopting new tools, building bigger homes, and reorganizing their societies. But in other regions, especially Northern Europe's tangled forests and soggy coastlines, the story was different. There, people kept doing what they'd always done for thousands of years after farming arrived. They hunted, fished, and foraged. At the Blethal Caverns, in what's now Germany, scientists found evidence of this overlap. From 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, some people lived just like their Mesolithic ancestors, eating river fish and wild game, with no crops in sight even while Neolithic farmers were planting fields just a few valleys over. One discovery says it all. A double burial containing a hunter, gatherer man, and a farmer woman buried together. Two different worlds. Two completely different ways of life. Side by side in death and maybe in life. That's more than archaeology. That's a window into a moment when humanity was literally marrying its past to its future. And this wasn't just about tools or food. It was about mindset. For many, hunting and gathering wasn't just primitive. It was a conscious way of life, more free, more mobile, more connected to the land. So the Mesolithic didn't end with a bang. It faded, slow and uneven, merging with the new world while stubbornly hanging onto the old one. A cultural twilight, not quite gone, not fully changed, stretching out for centuries. And maybe, just maybe, it was during this twilight that something new emerged. Identity. Not just surviving or inventing, but asking who we were, where we came from, and what kind of future we wanted to build. Today, we're living through a transition just as strange. Climate shifts, AI revolutions, a breakdown of traditional systems, a world changing faster than most can keep up. And like our Ice Age ancestors, we're all being asked the same question: do we embrace the future like the first Neolithic farmers did? Or do we hold on to what's left of the old ways, our routines, our instincts, our freedom, like the last Mesolithic hunters? There's no single right answer. Both are valid, both are human. But one thing's for sure, the past might just be the best survival guide we have for the present. So, if this made you rethink what it means to be modern, hit subscribe. Every week, we go back to the turning points when the world changed, not through declarations, but through flint, bone, and memory. Because to figure out what tomorrow might look like, sometimes you have to rewind all the way to 3 million years ago.